Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique fall and cross and some of the more important principles, rules, theories, concepts, and strategies of this technique. So let's start out with the overall strategy of the technique. It's pretty simple. We're getting the upper hand. In other words, we're getting leverage over our opponent by reacting to what they're doing to us, creating an angle of disturbance and maintaining that angle of disturbance as much as possible as we begin to counter. So let's talk through that to begin with. If you notice, this is from a rear two-hand choke, which is called an implied major from the rear. So normally, since we're in a non-ready position, we have to obey rule number one, which is establish our base. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be stepping off to the side. This has a couple different effects. So let's start out with how it applies to rule number one. So remember what we said we were going to do. We're going to create an angle of disturbance. So are we establishing a base? Yes, but not really the best base we could hope for. So why is that okay if rule number one is so important? Because of the rest of the strategy of this technique. Because as I begin to apply my beginning salvo against this opponent, what I'm doing is I'm destabilizing them, creating that angle of disturbance while I'm stabilizing myself. In other words, getting the upper hand conceptually and physically with my hands. Okay, so let's turn sideways so that we can discuss that a little bit more. So what I'm doing is I'm alleviating that choke through two things. One, moving my center line off to the side so that they don't have a direct grab. And two, I'm beginning to apply a lock to their thumbs. I'm not breaking their thumbs, but what I'm doing is I'm putting my hand right below their joint and applying the pressure to that bottom joint. So why am I doing that and how are we creating this angle of disturbance? Well, what I'm doing is I'm applying pressure to that thumb and they are locking out their own arm, potentially going up at their tippy toes, and that creates that angle of disturbance. So why don't I break it? Because of the fact that there's levers, okay? If they begin to bend their elbow, they can start pulling me backwards. I want to lock out those elbows so they can't do that. If I do a break and pull this forward, guess what? I'm no longer forcing those elbows to self-lock, and therefore I'm giving them the potential to take over me, or in other words, let them get the upper hand. So all this stuff is in that initial maneuver. Okay, now one thing to keep in mind is this is a potential angle of disturbance. It's not, what I mean by that is I'm applying this pressure, but there's no guarantee that I'm going to force them up on their tippy toes. But this brings in the concept of a change-up point. I could, if I feel that I've got this really good, I can move on to something else like our technique. If I feel I don't have it and they're not up on their tippy toes, I might have to force an angle of disturbance on them. So keep that in mind as we go forward. But in this case, I get this, I got that really nice angle of disturbance, they're up on their tippy toes, so I'm able to come over here and lock up their arms. So the step is important because it is done in a very specific way. What I don't want to do is give up my levers. Remember, what we want to try and do is keep our backs up straight, because the more we lean over, the more they can take advantage of us. In other words, another way to think about it is the more we bend over, the less we keep our levers and allow them to take over our levers with their levers. In other words, if they keep their back up straight and I don't, they can take advantage of me. So how does that affect this motion? I do not want to turn and bend over, because notice what happens. I give up that lever. So what I want to do is step, keeping my back up straight as I begin to apply this lock. And notice I now have that angle of disturbance from being up on their tippy toes to now bending forward. Okay, so I'm crossing these arms up, trying to create that angle of disturbance. So now what we're going to do is we're going to follow up with this kick and this elbow. So let's talk through some important ideas here. First, let's talk about how this kick is done. It's not a standard kick. We're not just coming through and kicking this opponent, but we should think about it that way. We should think about continuity of motion. What that means is I don't want to stop halfway through and then continue forward. Just like thrusting, salute, or any other techniques that have kicks in there, we're going to do it the same way with our motion going forward. But what's different? What we're doing is a delayed front kick. So what that means is we're going to be first using our knee, the short range weapon, in order to break this elbow, or both of these elbows, and we'll get back to that in just a second. And then after the knee, we're going to extend our leg and come forward, doing that front kick into the body, and then continuing forward with that elbow. Okay, so let's rewind just a little bit and cover that through a different lens. In this case, what's happening with our hands and the knee? There's a couple different ways to do this. I could just hit and try and break those knees, and that would be through striking. What I want to do is use opposing forces. So what I want to do is cross these arms up as much as possible, potentially exposing those elbows as much as possible. So as I begin to do the kick, I'm going to pull and think of wrapping those elbows or doing a double elbow break or lock around my leg as I begin to do that. And then continue to extend forward into that front kick. Now, the last piece here is the power principle that we're using. This is all backup mass, just like many of our other techniques that are very similar to this. So what we don't want to do is do this elbow on a circle. We are using backup mass, so we need alignment. So as we do this, think of this as a vertical punch or a straight punch, only doing the short range because we're so close to the opponent, okay? So the concept behind that is backup mass is made possible through alignment. So what you want to do is think as straight lines as we're doing this, only with an elbow. Okay, so now that we've talked through all this, well, let's do a quick execution so that you can see it being done, and we'll do it on this line. Up. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.